Are you tired of going out, trying to throw a jig head minnow and not catching fish? Well, today's video, we're going to be going over some of the, or probably the biggest misconception about the whole strolling phenomenon that has kind of taken over professional bass fishing and, even on the local level. Guys out there are trying to go find fish utilizing their forward-facing sonar, and typically the jig head minnow is one of the easiest ways to do it. We're going to be talking about that big misconception of strolling and how you can fix a lot of what you're doing on the water to help you catch more bass. I'm Sam, this is Lake Pro Tackle. Let's go ahead and dive right into it. Strolling or forward-facing sonar, jig head minnowing is one of those techniques that has really broken out not only last year, but the last couple years since the release of LiveScope, and really it has all become mainstream now. Going to the lake and seeing people out in open water, around creek channels, even on like tree areas or any vertical cover really, you can throw a jig head minnow and typically get fish to bite. However, one of the kind of like creme de la creme, like top of the line baits that typically sell the most are going to be your strolling specific baits, like a Sakamata shad from Depths, a Raid fish roller, and several other ones, just to name a few here. But I'm going to talk to you a little bit more specifics on the rolling action versus the dead action versus, what do you have to mix and match to get the best end result. So let's go ahead and talk about the whole rolling action. If you're unfamiliar, something like a Sakamata shad, a Last Ace, and a Raid fish roller, again, these have an amazing side-to-side strolling slash rolling action. Now, this action is generally determined by the actual build of the bait or the jig head that you use, which can amplify that. So on a scale of having like no action to strolling action, you've got to find your happy middle ground depending on the fish that you're specifically targeting. Other baits out there that do an amazing job of being just a jig head minnow are something like the Rapala Crush City Freeloader, the Cast Echo, and there are so many more out there, not just by these big companies, but I know a lot of smaller companies are also coming out with their jig head minnows, and each one has their specific place. The Spunk Shad from Missile Baits is another great option. You can pair it up with a really good jig head, and that still has a great strolling action. However, there are a few subtle differences that make the really good strollers really good and the kind of mid ones really mid. So we're going to talk about how to pair those up and give you the right action for your fish. Now, the whole strolling action has really originated from, and I think one of the main things people miss is the strolling action gives that bait more of a horizontal side-to-side play. Now, when you think about it this way, I think a lot of anglers just don't think about what they're trying to imitate. They just try to imitate what is on camera. Now, a strolling action, as a fish is chasing behind this lure, they can really see this bait as it's going left and right and left and right, trying to get away. It is a fleeing response, and that triggers bass into wanting to go eat it. Now, when it comes to the strolling, the left, right, you're really trying to trigger that fish into making a decision on whether to eat it. Now, typically on most retrieves, on just about everything out there, maybe besides a jerk bait, a glide bait, you really don't have a lot of change of direction. With a crankbait or spinner bait, it is typically a straight retrieve. You don't get that side-to-side darting action. You don't go anywhere on the horizontal plane. Same thing with a jig typically, or a Carolina rig. It has some variance, but whenever you add in that horizontal plane where that bait can shift left to right or track some way different, that is an extra secondary action that gets those fish to commit into biting your specific lure, no matter what it is. So really building off of that horizontal plane, that movement, that extra something that gets those bass into eating, we have to really talk about and break down the difference between the vertical plane and the horizontal plane. Now, the vertical plane is simply, going to be going away from that bass. So assuming you have a bass that is following your bait, going up in the vertical plane or even going down in the vertical plane can really immediately shut that bass off or immediately get that bass to trigger. In my experience on the water, throwing Alabama rigs, jig head minnows, scoping them with a swim jig, being able to watch hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of hours on the water looking at fish. That vertical movement is like one end or the other. They commit or they don't commit. Typically, I think the vertical movement of your bait in presentation to the bass is really dependent on the conditions that you have. Bass have air bladders. They have to have a specific barometric pressure to really feel good in the water. People always talk about the fall transition and the spring transition being extremely, extremely tough. And really, those 2 times of the year have the highest changes in barometric pressure. When you think of a high barometric pressure day, typically going to be bluebird skies, no wind. There's going to be a lot of pressure on those fish, high barometric pressure. When it comes to low barometric pressure, like today, I've got a lot of clouds outside, and those fish are really able to move up and down in the water column according to what feels comfortable to them. Just like you or I might get altitude sickness, moving up and down, or if you free dive or anything with scuba gear going down in depth, that extra pressure buildup can make you feel nauseous. And I think that's where a lot of this vertical movement can really hurt you, especially if you're not paying attention to it. And I think there is a good amount of science behind it, moving in that vertical plane. Of course, a lot of fish do like to relate to cover. They will get comfortable in places they need to, especially maybe down in a brush pile, a lay down, something like that. But when it comes to these roaming fish, adding that vertical movement can really trigger them really fast, but it can also shut them off really fast. For example, this past weekend, I was fishing for a couple fish that were still suspended pretty high in the water column, but whenever I brought that lure higher and higher and higher, they just wouldn't go above a certain level, because I think that is a cutoff for them to where they just don't feel comfortable, or they don't think they want to exert that extra movement to go chase down a bait. This also plays into the size of your bait. One of the biggest differences between a lot of the pros right now and a lot of just the average angler is they are willing to throw the 6, 7, 8-inch baits at these fish. Of course, bigger the target, I'm gonna say 99% of the time, the more effective it is at moving that fish, number one, and number two, it is more likely to hunt down a bigger meal with the same amount of effort than rather chase down a smaller meal with just about the same amount of effort. They don't want to just chase little fish around all day. They want a good hearty meal, a big gizzard shad, perhaps a big bluegill or tilapia, depending on where you are in the country. This can really make or break that as well. So there's so many factors that we've talked about. We've talked about the horizontal plane, talked about the vertical plane, talked about the lure choice, and we will talk a little bit more about the lure choice coming up, but let's talk about some other factors that can really impede the amount of success you have on the water with forward-facing sonar. Kicking it off, a lot of anglers have chosen to go with more tippy rods, or I'm gonna say more tippy in a sense that most of the rods these anglers are throwing, or if you have had a lot of success with a certain rod, you might notice these rods have a very soft tip section. And this plays into that vertical factor. As you sit there and either shake the minnow or give a little movement to the minnow, that softer tip will absorb a lot of that extra movement. So, as you shake the rod, when you impart action on that bait through your line, through the jig head into that minnow, you are moving it less than a traditional ultra fast rod tip. So having that nice soft rod tip will allow that line to really load and then deload and load and deload. And instead of moving your bait like a whole foot, those small shakes and having that rod tip absorb a lot of that is really not moving that bait as much. So, one of the fan favorites here at Lake Pro Tackle is going to be the X Pride. This is the 6'10" medium SB. This is a solid tip rod. Again, it has a very, very soft rod tip, which absorbs a lot of that extraneous movement going in that vertical plane. Another very, very popular one among Elite Series anglers, as well as a lot of our really good customers around here, is this guy right here. This one's a little bit more powerful, made to throw some of those bigger jig heads ranging into that like quarter or even 3/8 ounce. This is the G Loomis 842 SJR. So that SJR is the spin jig rod. Again, it's going to have that little bit softer tip. It's not quite as soft as that solid tip on the X Pride, but it still has an amazing amount of just overall movement on the tip. It's able to be, maneuvered extremely easily. One of the contrasts we make here in the store explaining this to customers is giving them the jig worm style versus the spin jig. That jig worm has very, very fast snapback. This one has a little bit extra tip section to absorb that shaking, and it allows that lure to really hunt side to side and really give you the best chance at hooking into those fish. Now, at the top level here, a lot of guys have chosen to go with the Poison Ultima. This guy right here specifically, a 7-foot rod, and this is going to be a medium/medium light rod. So this one here, again, has that very, very soft tip section. Look at that. I mean, it is incredible what some of these rods do. This uses the Spiral X and High Power X ultimate light rod using the carbon monocoque as well. So these are just 3 examples. There's so many out there, especially in different price ranges, that you just want to look for a rod that has a good amount of backbone and a softer tip section. St. Croix Legend X2 has some good ones, but they're a little bit different. I say you don't want an extra fast rod, but they label their extra fast tips as very, very soft tips. Those are excellent for this jig head minnow technique. Now, moving on to your line, something that also affects the vertical movement of your bait is your line diameter. Whether you go with a kind of like strictly JDM style line that has ultra thin diameters, or you go with kind of like your standard American brand. Of course, these don't typically break the bank. As you go thinner and thinner and thinner for higher pound test, that is going to get a little more pricey, but here at Lake Pro Tackle, we've got a good mix of both. So you can definitely give us a call, shoot me an email, send a DM to the store, and we can help you pick the right line for your situation. But as you go bigger inline diameter, that is going to increase the amount of drag going through the water. And as you add more drag, that bait wants to rise more and more. So you've got to be very, very precise with how much movement you're actually putting into that rod tip. And of course, watching it on the sonar will, really give you an idea, a really good idea of how much you're taking that bait away from the fish. Now, going back to the horizontal movement, depending on your lure, you can really increase its efficiency on that strolling action or decrease it utilizing different style jig heads. Now, one of the just all-time favorites out there, of course, is the Owner. It is going to be the round head. This ultra round head is great for some of those bigger ones. Of course, the Owner rolling head, strolling head as well. That's going to be a great one for some of your smaller minnows. But some new ones that have come out recently that I want to let y'all know about is going to be the Horizon Head series from Kamikatsu. These guys right here use an amazing, more like a O'Shaughnessy bend on the hook. Keeps those fish really, really well pinned, especially having that bigger weight at the end. They can, most of the time, especially on a normal round bend, those fish can easily shake those. These right here have that O'Shaughnessy bend, deep cut bend, keeps those fish locked on, those Horizon heads. And then another one, brand new from VMC actually, this one here is the Minnow shaker head. It uses a monofilament resin mix right here to keep your baits on. This one is a little bit different. This one actually uses a 45-degree head. This is a great one for your freeloaders and the mooch minnow. This was designed for that, but when it comes to, I think, my personal opinion, I prefer a 90-degree head for the most movement. It's going to give you, I think, the easiest time. And of course, there are some other ones out there like the Queen Tackle, which have that line tie actually in the back, shooting backwards, which in my testing has both helped and not helped depending on the lure. So when you take something like a Last Ace, which has already an amazing left to right action, horizontal action, and you pair it up with one of these, you're going to add a lot of movement. Now, this also plays into the mood of the fish, which changes day to day, changes hour to hour. If you have too much movement, too much horizontal or vertical movement, those fish might be turned off. So sometimes, some days, I can literally just sit there and dead stick and almost just drag that bait above the fish's head and just slowly move, slowly move it. I don't have to stroll it per se, but that will still get them to bite. Another really, really cool thing is the head size. Now, of course, the bigger head you go, the faster that bait is going to sink. So adding a bigger head will allow you to get more erratic strolling motion, but it's also going to decrease the amount you can move that bait vertically. So some things to think about, you know, all the things to consider: your line, your jig head choice, what's the mood of the fish, and typically if you're in an area, you can pretty well gauge what those fish want to do. But you know, you don't have to have a crazy strolling action to catch bass, and this is one of the things that a lot of people don't think about. Again, just that horizontal movement gives them something to really think about. Do I want to chase this bait? It's not going higher, but it might dart left and right. This is something that you can use to your advantage to go out there and catch more bass. So guys, I hope you enjoyed this video here. Leave a like on it if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel. We've got a whole bunch more content. Of course, we're not just doing tips and tricks like this, but we've also got gear reviews. So make sure to check out all the cool videos that we have currently on the channel. If you need anything from us, shoot us an email, a DM, social media, Instagram and Facebook, and we will see you in the next video here at Lake Pro Tackle. See you guys.